Well, thanks, Mark. The biggest challenge, my goodness, in the current context that I work, and in putting together this new policy on children in adversity, and trying to not only describe the problem but get some sense about what does work. I think in that context, the biggest challenge is what works in one context hasn't necessarily been tested in another context. And so when you talk about effectiveness or efficacy, it's limited to context. And as I mentioned earlier, so much of what's gone through rigorous scientific inquiry has happened in this country and Europe. And there are questions whether the context here align neatly, say, with context in Pakistan or context in Uganda. This then leads to, I think, the biggest need, which is moving from project evaluation, moving from individual pieces of research to the kind of efficacy trials that look at these things across different contexts, but take into the question too, not only scalability, which is critical, but also sustainability. So I think that's the challenge, and I think that's the direction we need to go.
What makes that challenge, you point out, particularly difficult is, you said the countries where we need to find out if it works, Pakistan or Afghanistan or Uganda, are the countries least likely to have the resources to spend to study the effectiveness of interventions to prevent violence against children. So the very evidence you need to get is the evidence that we don't have the money to develop. So in those countries where we need to find out desperately what works, we don't have the resources now to test the effectiveness of those interventions, to scale them up.
I'll respond to that. That is a challenge that we can't do it everywhere. But one of the things that's most exciting that's going on, and it's in the incubation stage at this point in time, and it involves different actors within the U.S. government, NIH, it involves at least one other multilateral, is the idea that we would, in one or two locations, probably one in Africa, one in Asia, create a longitudinal life cycle type of research. A kind of, if you're familiar with RACI, it's sort of been really, really important for reproductive health. We're envisioning something like this in at least two locations. That won't answer all the questions or problems, but it will give us the kind of robust evidence base that we don't currently have.
Thanks, Neil. Daniela, the biggest single challenge you've ever faced gathering or using evidence?
It's a tough one. Building on what was said, I think, the challenge that I see is a little based on what you were saying, Neil. We have what we call these boutique projects, right? So you go into Village X, and there are 100 people that participate in this project, and you've thought of everything, and you've controlled everything, and it's great, but that's one thing. And then saying, okay, let's move now to Tanzania and make this happen in Tanzania, that's a whole nother ballgame. And I think there are a couple of pieces there. The first is this idea of sustainability and making sure that it's not only sustainable, but that it's multi-sectoral. I think that's a huge challenge, that you can't just say, okay, it's the Ministry of Health, we're going to work with you on this. It's not. It really has to be justice, education, and to bring all of these actors together, as well as there's the UN family, the different bilaterals, at a country level. I think really thinking about this multi-sectorally in terms of the response becomes extremely challenging. I mean, we have challenges working with 7 U.S. agencies. Think about when you're talking about it at a country level. So I think, that's the biggest challenge. But the answer to that, I think, just to go on for a second, is a little bit of what you were saying, which is, one, making sure people understand, yes, there is a problem, there is violence. And that can be done through a variety of ways. And then the second one is to help people understand, and it can be prevented. Because the first thing people will say is, oh, okay, there's all this violence, but there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think that's then it's translating what we know, and the evidence there is, for this broad range of actors to create action at a national level, I think is the largest challenge.
Thanks, Danielle. Very helpful to understand. Jerry.
It kind of goes back to where you started, Mark, and that is it's a very tough problem. And so I think the frustration I often feel is that, there is no single causative factor for suicide. I think the field is pretty compelled about that. There is no single solution to suicide. The causes are many, and therefore the solutions have to be as well. And so I think the greatest frustration I feel is because it is such a difficult and complex problem to understand, working with folks who want to do something to understand that no single evidence-based practice or no single intervention is likely going to resolve the problem. And as others have said, finding a way and I keep going back to the Air Force because I think it's a good example. There's another system at the Henry Ford Health Center that talks about changing the entire system. So when someone comes in from top to bottom, everybody's on board about that patient's care to make sure that they have, if you will, a zero suicide outcome. They really want to do that. And I think the challenge is convincing people that that is the way, making sure that they all sit at the same table, understand the data that they're trying to address, come up with solutions that go from when you first walk into an emergency room to 60 days after you've been released from the emergency room. How connected are you to the community that's going to help sustain your recovery? And sometimes I think we still look at this as one solution is the answer, when I really don't think that's it at all. So I think we have to really keep pushing the envelope and keep challenging ourselves to force the right players to come to the table and then share in the journey and share in the celebration when they tackle the problem.
I think that problem that Jerry raises, that the solution doesn't come in one bite. It's not all or none. To use the analogies in this forbidden area, it's not a silver bullet. There's no one magic bullet that's going to be the answer to the whole problem of suicide prevention, but the answers are going to come incrementally. So Daniela talked about the importance of sustaining an endeavor. I mean, you find one thing that works and you add on another thing that works and another thing that works. This is what's been done in highway safety. So in the 60s, we had a huge epidemic of deaths of our young people. Talk about the importance Jim mentioned of keeping our young people safe. People were being killed in droves on the highways. And what they did was they invested in research, in data generation and data collection, and they redesigned cars. They put in airbags and seat belts and side airbags and front impact collection. They made cars safer. They redesigned roads. They put in traffic circles and speed bumps and made them curvy and hilly, so cars had to go slow. They put protection along the sides so you couldn't crash into trees. And they redesigned drivers, and they took alcohol-impaired drivers off the roads. But it was incrementally doing many things. And as you know, if you have kids, you're scared to death now when they go out and start to drive. The problem has not been totally solved. These answers are going to be incremental, and we need to collect data over a sustained long period of time because we're not going to have the answer to these problems. And banning assault weapons, banning high-capacity magazines, and even having effective background checks on all gun purchasers is not going to solve the problem once and for all. But the data collection, the evidence generation has to be sustained over a long period of time because the answers to these problems are going to be incremental. So again, one of the really important challenges that I think you hear all of us talk about is the need to sustain this effort over time to deal with complex problems that have complex solutions that will come piece by piece. Mary Lou, the toughest challenge you've had?
Well, it's interesting, Mark, when you were talking about the need to sustain these efforts over time. Another reason we have to sustain them over time is that in the arena of public safety, criminal justice issues, the problems are constantly morphing. And you have to be able to kind of go with the flow, do perpetual evaluation, and tweak your approach according to the results that you are getting at that point in time. Because these things change all the time. Here's one example. Drug trafficking used to be primarily, open air markets. You could drive into certain neighborhoods and you'd see all the drug dealers out on the corner hustling business. then it moved kind of inside, especially in public housing developments where they could kind of hide out. Now we're seeing a tremendous amount of online crime, and we're also seeing some of these criminals morphing into new industries, so to speak. A lot of these people who used to traffic drugs are now trafficking young girls for sexual exploitation. And so you can't ever be satisfied that you really understand what's going on, you've assessed the problem, you've developed a solution, and that solution is going to be it. You have to be, as I said, perpetually evaluating and tweaking those approaches. The other big challenge, which I heard echoed across the table today, is the need to take a comprehensive approach. We've been talking about protecting children from violence. The Attorney General has an initiative called Defending Childhood, which is really all about preventing children, children from being exposed to violence in the first place, and when they are exposed, to providing the right kind of intervention at the right time and trauma-informed care so that you will mitigate the impact of that exposure. But what we discovered through hearings that our task force's experts conducted across the country and through research is that, no surprise, this is not just a criminal justice issue. This is schools, this is public health, this is strengthening families, this is economic development, this is housing, this is safe passage to school. It is so complex, and really getting your arms around that is very, very challenging, and getting the right players to the table so that we know what resources we have to apply to this problem, and everybody knows what he or she or his or her agency is going to do, and that we're unified in moving forward. That is an enormous challenge.
Thanks, Mary Lou. Let me come back to another sort of challenge, because in Martha's wonderful opening talk, she alluded to this, that sometimes, and probably not just sometimes, countries don't want it known that they have a very high incidence of failing to protect their children, of child sexual abuse, of violence against children, of child neglect. This is not something that countries want to come out. Neil mentioned that sometimes the critical surveillance that needs to be done, the collecting of very basic information, is threatened by budget cuts, and very important institutions that have been set up to gather these data can be put out of business. I want to come to the question and ask you, in your work, have you encountered enemies of evidence collection? Have you had opponents who actively sought to keep you from generating, integrating, or disseminating the evidence that you have found? And what kind of challenges have you seen there? I see everybody smiling, so that means you must have some wonderful experiences and answers.
Well, Mark, I think your question could get us fired, because we might have to look a bit internally. But obviously the answer is yes, and it's quite fascinating. As a public health professional or professor, whatever I'm called, I have spent a lot of time working on measurement of violence, and I looking at sexual violence in families and whatnot. And what I can say with some certainty is it is measurable. And there's ways to do that. There's ways to do that beyond sort of the prevalence studies. There's ways of asking. You have to figure out where the information sits. It exists, but it won't necessarily sit with the police. It won't necessarily sit with the UN. But sisters know it, neighbors know it, and the victims themselves know it. So you've got to tap into that informal information network. And tapping into that informal information network is sometimes a big obstacle. that multilaterals, governments, and others don't necessarily want you to muck around with. So that's one of the challenges. I think if you look at sexual violence of girls and boys in schools, and you come up with high estimates in certain countries, there's the school administrators, there's the government, there's the teachers, there's others that don't want you collecting that information and acting on that information. And I could go on with different examples, but I'll just sort of summarize. This is something that needs to be addressed. It is something that's addressable. It is measurable, and we can do much better than we're doing now. Sustaining the effort over time requires not only funding, but it also requires courage. And it requires, I think, those of us in this room to continue sometimes to talk to professionals, people in United Nations organizations that may put forward political correctness before they put forward efficacy. We're going to encounter it at all levels. And I think as a community, we're going to have to get together and speak from a standpoint that this is doable. And there's going to be some painting, in all gains. Public health doesn't happen without some adverse consequences. We want to keep those as minimal as possible. But progress also, there's pain with progress, and we need to move forward together.
Neil, as a former bureaucrat and proud to have been a bureaucrat for 20 years and served my country, I'm very sensitive to your position now, where you say you don't have tenure as a bureaucrat, although you do as a professor.
Nor would I want it, by the way.
So explain just briefly why you said this could get us fired.
Oh, I'm teasing a little bit, but I mean, information is very important and very, very, very powerful. If we actually were honest, for example, about the efficacy of some of our programs, we would not be claiming that they're the best thing since sliced bread. If we're really honest about the way that individual agencies evaluate their own programs, and having participated in some $100 million kinds of program evaluations, it borders on fiction sometimes. So we need to move as well to a more independently determined base of efficacy studies. I mean, I could go on, but I do want to stick around for another year, so I'll.
Thanks, Neil. Daniela, enemies of the evidence.
Well, since he already answered the tough part, I'm going to let that stand and not touch that one. As a bureaucrat myself, I think there are two pieces here that come to mind. The first is kind of what Neil was talking about. I think the importance of process here. So, you're really balancing sometimes this political piece with the evidence-based piece. So you have a leader in a country that wants to, say X, and the data is saying Y. I mean, that's a tough position to be in. And I think part of our challenge is the way we do things. So Tanzania has been coming up over and over again, which is great. And it's very exciting that, PEPFAR was part of this process. Jim Mercy is here, Michelle, all the people, UNICEF, Teresa, are part of this Together for Girls partnership under which this is happening. The process is you don't just go out there and do a survey and then say, here's the data. You have to, from the beginning, be really working with the key stakeholders, the communities, the government, so that everyone understands before you even embark on their survey, what are you trying to do here? What are the questions? What's happening here? In that way, everyone, I think, feels more part of the process, especially if they feel like together with this particular piece where we're going to say, hey, there's a huge problem here, you can also say, and there's a solution, and this is what we're going to do together as a country to resolve that. Politicians like that a lot better than just a survey that says, here's the problem. And so I think you need to think critically about all those pieces when you start embarking on this process. But there are challenges. I just want to say one other thing, which is another challenge I find a lot is I'm working very much in a kind of clinical world where we're working with a lot of nurses, medical doctors, people who are very focused on the trial of, medicine X to address disease Y. And the way you look at evidence for that field is very different from the way you look at evidence in the field that we're discussing. This whole like incremental steps, that's a great example, actually, the highway safety. I mean, you have to start explaining to some of these decision makers, and I do that a lot, that, the kinds of evidence that we're collecting are not going to look the same as the evidence that you got on this particular trial of this drug. And so, I wouldn't say they're enemies, but sometimes there's a lot of education that needs to happen along the way to kind of inform folks who are coming from a different perspective and don't necessarily value the kinds of evidence that we're able to produce in the social and behavioral sciences in the same way that you get from some of what the so-called hard sciences are. I think that's another challenge.
People sometimes talk about the hard sciences and the softer sciences. And this area that we're talking about, these multidisciplinary, long-term evaluations of outcomes or problems, there are hard sciences and then there are the harder sciences. And I think what we're talking about here are the harder sciences, to be sure. So enemies of the evidence. Jerry?
As you can imagine, there aren't many people who would speak up against suicide prevention. So I'm thankful for that. We don't have enemies per se. The challenge is, and I think if I were to think about this, it's how do you present this public health issue alongside of all the other public health issues that warrant action and being addressed. And so it's difficult sometimes to reach the attention of your policymakers and others about this issue because the evidence is still evolving for this issue. It's not nearly as robust as the evidence in some fields, but there's enough to say it's time to move. And I think I go back often when I think about the direction we go in, and it's not so much about enemies as it is about allies. And in the field of suicide prevention, I'm reminded of a health policy model, Cuddlechuck and Richmond, that has always been comforting to me, where they say if you want public health to succeed in a given area, you need three things. You need a strategy, you need political will, and you need an evidence base. So you need the knowledge, you need the political will, and you need a strategy. And for suicide prevention, I think we've done this rather well. We have a strategy. The nation released it. The Secretary of Health and Human Services and others came together to do this, and Dr. Satcher and others back in 2001. We have an evolving evidence base both on what's in the best practices registry that we oversee, as well as SAMHSA's National Registry for Evidence-Based Practices, which has over 220 entries. And we also have political will, both from the advocates, those bereaved, those who are touched by suicide or personally struggle in their own lives, who are willing to carry their story, couple it with a policy objective, and hopefully continue to advance the field and give life to some of the 60 objectives that are in this plan. So I think it's very important that we look at who are the allies that can help us carry the message, because frankly, most members of the Hill don't want to hear from me as the policy wonk. They'd rather hear from the people who've been personally touched, who are carrying a public policy objective. And when they hear it from that perspective and the evidence is coupled with it, I think our chances of success are much more likely.
Thanks, Jerry. So we need to find, not only identify the enemies, but identify our allies in our attempt to bring evidence forward and to use it to get attention and time on the agenda of critical policymakers. Mary Lou.
I think that expediency is the enemy of evidence. And by that I mean some of the things we talked about before. It takes a long time to really evaluate an approach to understand whether it works. And we have police chiefs out there saying people are dying on the streets. I can't wait for you to evaluate this approach and tell me whether it's going to work. I have a crisis and I need to address the crisis. So there's that. It does take a long time for us to really come to a full understanding of whether or not something, a practice is evidence-based, for instance, a program really works. That's very challenging because people have things they need to take care of right away and they're impatient. They don't want to wait for that evidence. The other aspect of that is that it takes time to be thoughtful in the way you approach any kind of problem, particularly if it's what we've been referring to here as a multi-sector issue that you're trying to address, which means multiple meetings, developing relationships, understanding each other's mission, and so on, all of that, which is so critically important. And people hear the march of time in the background the entire time. So that's a big challenge, and I think that being able to demonstrate that it is worth the time in every respect to evaluate, to come together, to take a unified, comprehensive approach, being able to demonstrate that is one of our biggest challenges and one of the most important things that we need to do.
Well, thanks, Mary Lou. And I want to take time to thank our panelists for a very, very thoughtful discussion, and not only for what you shared with us that I think will give us things to think about as we go forward over the next 2 days, but also to thank you for what you do and the work that you have done and the challenges that you do take on, from large-scale studies that read like they're fiction to how do you take the time to get someone to give you a chance to collect the evidence for addressing these very large problems. But to thank you for what you contributed to us here today and for everything that you do that's so very, very important. So please join me in thanking our panelists.